श्रीरामचन्द्र कृपालु भज मन हरण भव भयदारुणं श्रीरामचन्द्र कृपालु भज मन हरण भव भयदारुणं नवकञ्जलोचन कञ्जमुखकर कञ्जपदकञ्जारुणं श्रीराम 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 श्रीरामचन्द्र कृपालु भज मन हरण भव भयदारुणं कन्दर्पगणित अमित छवि नवनील नीरजकुञ्जनं पटपीतमानहु तडितरुचि शुचि नौमि जनकसुतावरं श्रीराम 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 भज दीनबन्धु दिनेश दानव दैत्यवंशनिकन्दनं रघुनन्द आनन्द कन्द कौशल चन्द दशरथनन्दनं श्रीराम 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 धीरे ना 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 सिर मुकुट कुण्डल तिलक चारु उदारु अंगविभूषणं आजानुभुज शर चापधर संग्रामजित खर दूषणं श्रीराम 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 इति वदति तुलसी दास शङ्कर शेषमुनिमनरञ्जनं मम हृदयकञ्ज निवास कुरु कमादिखलदलगञ्जनं श्रीराम 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 धीरे धिं धिं तन धीरे धीरे धिं धिं तन धीरे धीरे धिं धिं तन धीरे धीरे नो श्रीरामचन्द्र कृपालु भज मन हरण भव भयदारुणं नवकञ्जलोचन कञ्जमुखकर कञ्जपदकञ्जारुणं श्रीराम 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 श्रीराम
Namaskar, my dear brothers and sisters, boys and girls. This devotional song that you heard in the melodious voice of Vasudhara Munshi was about Rama, expressing its devotion to Rama, expressing the devotee's devotion to Rama, and describing him by the various attributes that we associate with the divine, full of love and grace, taking care of all our difficulties and obstacles, and so on. The other day we discussed the question, who am I? And saw that we are not just the body and the mind, which we can easily identify ourselves with, but we also have a soul. And that the soul also has a dynamic aspect, the psychic being, that helps us make the most authentic choices in life, especially what we call moral choices. And the choice that we get from there goes beyond any written ethical code. It is situation specific and has a universal character. A person would get the same type of a voice from the psychic being in a similar situation, irrespective of which culture the person grew up in, where the person was born, etc., etc. So that is the authenticity of the voice coming from this universal source in a way, because the soul is the representative of the divine in us, and that's why this voice is so dependable. However, since the soul is a spark of the divine, a representative of the divine, it doesn't have just this role of guiding us at crucial moments, because the characteristics of the divine are that it is all-knowing and all-powerful, which means it can do and know. These are the two important characteristics of the divine. So the psychic being helps us not only in making these choices, but it also helps us in doing. What it means is it helps us exceed the normal limitations of the body and the mind. And that is what yoga is about, as we have also seen in some of the previous sessions, that what we are doing in different systems of yoga is essentially trying to bring the influence of a higher part of the being on the lower, and the highest being the soul and its dynamic aspect, the psychic being, bringing the influence of the psychic being on the body and the mind will help go beyond the limitations of the body and the mind, and what we call self-exceeding, which means that we'll be able to exceed the usual capacities of the body and the mind, which means we'll be able to do bodily what we normally can't do, and we'll be able to think and know at the level of the mind, which we normally can't. Now this, besides doing, the other aspect is knowing. So if psychic being doesn't just provide the type of knowledge which can serve as a guide, it provides us also knowledge which is not normally accessible to the intellect. And that is something that we normally call intuition. And intuition, as Aurobindo has looked at it, is actually a level higher than the intellect, and therefore it needs to be trusted, although we generally don't, because the way we are constituted, we place far greater reliance on what the intellect tells us, what is seemingly reasonable and rational. But what seems reasonable and rational need not always be true, and what seems completely unreasonable may sometimes in fact be true. And that's, now science has also shown that the type of things that are based on the theory of relativity or the quantum theory are completely contrary to common sense, and yet they are more true than what we find in Newtonian mechanics. But anyway, leaving aside that, although intuition is at a level higher than the intellect, and that's how Aurobindo has looked at it, in the ordinary life, and the common man doesn't necessarily use the word intuition that way. We often use it, rather loosely, and equate intuition with a gut feeling, a hunch, and so on and so forth. All these things are clubbed together as something which is there somewhere in our mind, but something which cannot be trusted. But all the same, we enjoy indulging in what hunch we have, or what intuition we have, or what our gut feeling is, and so on. And therefore, what can happen sometimes is that we want something, we are not sure at the level of the intellect, and we just say that, but intuitively I think so. What it means is that I wish it were so. So our wishful thinking sometimes comes camouflaged as an intuition. And that is something which we have to guard against. This reminds me of an exercise which a Canadian friend, Karen Hamden, who was there at least in the inaugural session. I'm probably she's watching some other sessions or seeing them later on. But this is an exercise that Karen shared with me once, which she does with girls who are in a relationship with a boy but are not sure whether the boy loves them. They love the boy madly. They are madly in love with the boy, The boy also professes love, but that is not consistent with what he actually does. When they are together, he's not very kind to her. But she's so madly in love that she goes on believing that he is in love with me, although she's not very sure at the level of the intellect, but she feels that intuitively I know that he loves me. Now, to protect such girls from an abusive relationship, because such a relationship could proceed towards a rather uh, undesirable and abusive relationship, to protect them from such a relationship, she has devised an exercise. What she does is tells them, uh, since you are not very sure whether he loves you, write on one piece of paper yes and on another piece of paper no. Fold them and shuffle them, and then pick up one of those papers, and whatever that paper says will be the answer to your question, does he love me? So you'll know whether the answer is yes or no. So the girl does it. Now after she has folded the pieces of paper and shuffled them, before she actually picks it up, she tells the girl that before you pick up the paper, just think, did some whisper cross your mind which told you which paper you will pick up? Will it be the paper which will say yes, or will it be the paper that will say no? And generally the girl has that in her mind. Some whisper has told her that this is the paper that I'll end up picking up, which says yes or no. So then she is told that whatever that whisper told you is the right answer. You can even ignore what the paper says. Of course, you can pick up the paper, but more reliable than that is what that whisper told you. Now, the way it works is somewhat like this. When she has been told about what exercise it is that she's going through, she has surrendered herself to the verdict of the paper that she picks up. In other words, she has surrendered herself to a higher power. It's like surrendering to a higher power, because now she feels that whatever answer I get from the paper is more reliable than what I can ever know. So it's like surrendering to a higher power. And since she has surrendered herself, her mind is silent. Both the emotional part of the being, which is trying to tell her that somehow I should find the answer that the boy loves me, and the intellect, because the emotional part of the being and the intellect can be very noisy. So they have been silenced, and that's what happens when you surrender to a higher force. Then that chatter stops, because now you feel that I am in the hands of someone who knows everything, and therefore this chatter is of no use. So her mind has been silenced. So in the background of this silence, when she hears that whisper actually is coming from her psychic being. And therefore that is truly an intuitive voice, because that's an honest voice, that's a sincere voice, which is coming in there when her mind, that is both the feeling and the thinking, the vital and the mental, the emotional part of the being and the intellect, when both of them are more or less silent, with that background she is still hearing a whisper that I'll pick up the paper which says yes, or I'll pick up the paper that will say no. So that is an authentic voice. And therefore, that can be the voice which can be truly called intuition, not what she was earlier thinking was her intuition, because that intuition, what she called an intuition, was just a wishful thinking, and from there the answer always came yes, because she was madly in love with the boy. So that when the chatter has been silenced, then only she gets that true voice of the psychic being, which can be described as an intuition. Now, of course, I may tell you something which you'll think is a superstition. Chances are that now when she picks up the paper, what that whisper was will coincide with what is written on that paper. Now, this may look like a superstition, but there is some evidence that that also happens. And why that happens, to some extent, has been explained in a book by David Hawkins, who is a psychiatrist but a deeply spiritual person. And he has written a book called Power versus Force. In that book, he talks about such phenomena, why that happens and how it happens. Because there is certain universal energy which ensures that in such situations that is what will happen. And therefore, chances are that it will be further reinforced, that whisper will be further reinforced by the paper that she actually ends up picking up. Now, today's topic will go further. and take this issue further beyond the soul, because the soul is only in an individual. Today we'll look at it from a larger issue, the entire worldview from the spiritual point of view, not just an individual from the spiritual point of view. And sometimes it's described in Hindi as the relationship between Jiva, Jagata and Jagadish. Now what it means is Jiva is the individual, Jagata is the universe, and Jagadish is the father or the creator of the universe. So what is the relationship between the creator, if any, and the individual? And what is the relationship of this individual with the rest of the creation? Now these are the type of questions which the spiritual worldview answers. But sometimes it may look that what is the use? It is probably just intellectual entertainment. That of course it is, and in fact these are among the sessions that people engage with very with great excitation, expectation and interest. So it is intellectual entertainment, but it also has great practical implications, because this is what will form the basis of what we'll discuss next in the next few sessions, that is the purpose of life. And all these sessions put together, who I am, what the spiritual worldview is, and what the purpose of life, form the basis of of what we will discuss still later, and that is stress management. Because it is these existential truths that give us the most durable and lasting solution to all stressful issues and give us true mental peace. So that's why it goes beyond, in fact, just an interesting intellectual exercise. It is something which has great practical implications. So with that, we can go to the presentation for today on the spiritual worldview. The love and blessings of the Mother Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch, and my humble salutations to them. The YES program is a part of the 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th anniversary of India's independence. The topic is the spiritual worldview, and the adjective spiritual itself implies that this is not the only worldview. There can be other worldviews. However, this is one of the most authentic ones. At least that's how people like me tend to believe. This is what we saw last time, that an individual is not just what is easily to identify with, that is the body and the mind having these two aspects, the emotions and the intellect, but also there is a soul, and we try to arrive at through a number of everyday exercises which make us feel that yes, there is a source of guidance available to us, which seems to come neither from the emotional part of the being nor the intellect, but from something deeper within, something that we call the voice of the deepest self, or just the inner voice. Now, if there is a soul, the next question that arises naturally is, who put it in there? Who put it in us? How did it get in? Is it in the head? Is it in the heart? These are the type of questions that naturally come to our mind. And to understand these questions, we have to go back in time. Go back in time to the time when none of what we identify as the material universe existed. Not only this world, nothing in the material universe existed. And naturally there must have been some time when none of this existed. But then how did it come into being, all that we call the universe? Was it an accident, or was it the result of an intelligent design? Now, logically, the first possibility that it might have been an accident can be easily ruled out, because an accident only leads to chaos, not anything orderly. For example, if somebody were to tell you that some beautiful poem we are talking about, was written accidentally by a monkey sitting at the keyboard of a computer, and somehow he happened to open the Word program and he started tapping on the keys, and accidentally it led to the creation of this poem, would you believe it? Because at the most it can create a haphazard collection of letters of the alphabet, but it will not be a poem. It will not have the order of a poem. So anything orderly presupposes the application of an intelligent design. So does the universe have some sort of an order, or is it some sort of a chaos? You might say it seems quite chaotic, so it might have been an accident. But then to understand that, let's go to a novel by Chetan Bhagat. Chetan Bhagat has written a novel called A Night at the Call Center. Now, in this novel, what happens is that in one of the incidents in this novel is there are 3 or 4 young people, boys and girls, in a car, and somehow they accidentally reach a point where the car is now balanced very delicately at a point. Just a little beyond it is a deep cliff. And then, just a little movement of the car would mean that they'll be thousands of feet down. And in such a situation, even reversing the car to get out of that situation is very risky. So they all start praying. And naturally, in such a situation, the prayer is extremely sincere. So what happens is that the phone of one of them rings. So their smartphones, they start ringing. So this person picks up the phone, who is calling, and is told, I am God calling. And I can save you. Now, they can't believe it. So they say, if you are really God, show us a miracle. And the answer they get is, if I show you a miracle, I will have to break the laws that I have myself made. Which means that God has made some laws which run the universe, and a miracle is that which would defy these laws. Of course, one way to look at it is that these laws are in themselves so perfect that a lot of things that happen in the world, if you are really sincere, would look like a miracle. But then God says that if I have to show you a miracle, which means something which really is beyond all these laws, I'll have to break the very laws that I have made. Now, God has made some laws, and that is why when scientists discover a law, they don't have to do an experiment every day or even every 100 years to verify that law is still true. If Boyle's law was true when Boyle discovered it, it's true even today. If Charles' law was true when he discovered it, it's true even today. So we don't have to keep verifying it again and again. So there are some laws which are consistent and seem to be more or less permanent, and that is what runs the universe. And therefore, although it may appear chaotic, there is a lot of order. So if there is order in the universe, it means that there must be the application of an intelligent design behind it. And if anyone can create something which has order, but such a complicated order that it looks like chaos, then that must be a supremely intelligent being. So the assumption is, therefore, logically, that before anything existed in the universe, some entity existed which then created this universe, and that entity was capable of doing everything and knowing everything. It knew everything and it could do everything. And knowing and doing are two aspects of consciousness, which means it was a consciousness, the supreme consciousness, the consciousness that knew everything and could do everything. And one of the things it could do was to create the universe. And that's how it did it. So now some people say that, well, that's only an assumption. How do we know such an entity existed? So therefore it's unscientific. Now let's look at the process of science itself. Science starts with a question. Here also we started with a question. How was the universe created? Was it an accident or an intelligent design? Every piece of research in science also starts with a question. And then after we have done some research and found some sort of an answer to that question, it's generally a tentative answer. That's what happens in science, but a reasonably sure answer. That answer itself raises a few more questions. And then we do some more research to answer those questions. And those questions, answers to those questions in turn raise more questions. And therefore what actually happens is that we are finding the reason behind something, and then we find the reason behind the reason, and then we find the reason behind the reason for the reason, and we keep going back. And then finally, where do we reach? We reach a point where we say, well, beyond this we don't know, but perhaps further research will show it. Which means that we collect a large amount of scientific knowledge, but when we keep going back in the questions that we answered one by one, finally we reach a point where we say, well, beyond that we don't know. And yet, we use this scientific knowledge in everyday life. That scientific knowledge, which when we go back beyond which we don't know, is still enough to land a man on the moon. So it means fairly useful working knowledge. So in science, we get satisfied with knowledge which goes just a little back, and beyond that we don't know, and still we are satisfied with that knowledge and we start applying it in life. Now here, we are going much, much, much further beyond what any scientific question can go. The period when nothing in the universe existed, we are going as back as that. And yet we are not prepared to make an assumption. So how scientific is refusing to make that assumption? Because without that assumption, we can't go any further. And therefore, we just assume that it was not an accident. It was the result of an intelligent design. And the designer was a supreme consciousness that was capable of knowing everything and doing everything. So that assumption we do start with. And then when this supreme consciousness decided to create the universe, it still faced one major problem. It had to create a material universe, but the material didn't exist anywhere. For example, suppose you want a table. You provide some wood to the carpenter. The carpenter is the creator, wood is the material, and the creation is the table. Now here the creator is there, but there's no material. But still the creator wants a material universe. Now Vedanta has solved this problem by saying that since this entity was capable of doing everything, one of the things it could do was to become material. So it itself became the material that it wanted to create. So it did not really create the universe, it became the universe. Now from this follows one important corollary. And that is, the universe is nothing but another form of the creator itself. Another form of the divine, another form of that supreme consciousness. And since it is another form of the same, from that it follows that it is present in every bit of the universe that it has created. And the form in which it is present everywhere is called the spirit. So the creator or the divine or the supreme consciousness is in there throughout the creation in the form of an all-pervasive spirit. We can understand it through a simple example. Suppose a child starts with a square piece of paper and makes a boat out of it. And then we ask the child, does the boat have the paper? The child would say, what a silly question. The boat itself has become the paper. So every bit of the boat is the paper. So in the same way, just as the paper itself became the boat, the creator itself became the creation. So naturally, it follows from it that the creator is present throughout the creation, in every bit of the creation, in every atom, in every electron, in every proton. It is present everywhere. But still we call it the spirit. Why do we call it the spirit? We call it the spirit that it is there everywhere and yet we don't see it. So something which is there, something basic, something fundamental, but it's not easily visible is called the spirit. For example, if we have a painting, we say that somehow the spirit of the painter has got into the painting. We don't see it. What we see is only a portrait or a landscape. But still we can feel that some bit of the personality of the painter has got into the painting, and that is what we say, this the spirit of the painter that is there in the painting. In the same way, although it's not easily visible, the spirit of the creator is there in all creation, and we call it the spirit because it is something basic, something fundamental to the creation, and yet it is not easily visible. Now this is also the reason why we call this particular way of looking at the universe the spiritual worldview, which means that this is a worldview that acknowledges the presence of the spirit of the creator everywhere in the universe. So that is why we call it the spiritual worldview, and from this follow words like such as spirituality, etc. So this is the spiritual worldview. That is the way of looking at the world that takes into account the all-pervasive spirit of the divine or the creator. Now how about the soul? The soul is not really different from the spirit. The spirit is there throughout the creation. We are also a part of that creation, and therefore the spirit is also within us. But within each individual, instead of calling it the spirit, we call it the soul. And that's why we use the word sometimes interchangeably also. When we say union of the body, mind, and spirit, we say the spirit, but what we mean is the soul of the individual. The soul of the individual is becoming one with the body and the mind, and there we are using them synonymously. So the spirit is universal, whereas the soul is individual. That is the only difference. Now we come to another corollary that arises from this. The creator had no dimensions, it was everywhere. So in a way it has infinite dimensions, and it had always been there, it will always be there. So it was not limited by time. So something that is not limited by time and space can be called the infinite. And then it created the creation which was characterized by multiplicity. So many units. So those units may be called n. Still finite, but all the same a very large number, but finite. So if the creator became all those finite pieces, the infinite became all those finite pieces, how much of that infinity is there in each individual, or in each individual piece or unit that it created? And the logic of the infinite in terms of mathematics tells us that if you divide infinity by any finite number n, the result will still be finite, which means that each individual, each atom, each electron in the creation also has the whole of that infinite in it. Looks paradoxical. If you divide something, only a part can be there, but the logic of the infinite tells us that the whole of it is there also in every bit that it has created. Another corollary, if you take something away, because the creation came out of the infinite, if you take anything finite away from it, what would be the remainder? Since the finite is still measurable and the infinity is beyond any measurement, the remainder will still be without any possibility of being measured, and therefore the remainder is also infinite. Now these two profound truths, which seem paradoxical but are consistent with the logic of the infinite mathematically, are embodied in a common prayer or mantra. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Now what it means is that the Purnam or the Purna or the complete is only the divine, everything else is partial. That complete thing, the divine, is present in this and that, which means in everything. It has a universal presence. Purnat Purnamudachyate. It is from the Purna, that is that complete thing, the divine, that everything complete emerged or came out, was born. It was born from that, which means that was the source of everything, and everything that came out was also Purna, was also complete. And then Purnasya Purnamadaya means if you take that complete thing out of that complete thing, because what came out was complete, and when that is taken away, subtracted from the complete thing with which he started, Purnam eva avashishyate. What is left behind, the remainder that is left behind, is also complete. That is also infinite. So this is embodied in this beautiful mantra. And the same thing is said in very simple words by David Hawkins, whom I talked about a short while back, the author of Power versus Force. The commonplace and God are not distinct. Now that the material universe has been created, how about the rest of the creation, the living beings, human being, and so on? Now just visualize the all-knowing, all-powerful becoming matter, the material universe, which seems to know nothing and can do nothing. So becoming matter was a sort of a gross self-limitation on the part of the divine. But then started the opposite process. This self-limitation is sometimes called involution. That just went within. Then it started emerging, coming out, started showing itself. Showing itself, coming out, emerging, unfolding is what evolution is about. And the first step in evolution was the creation of life. And that can be seen as the hidden consciousness of the divine in matter revealing a little bit of itself. So the possibility of life was hidden in matter because the consciousness of the Supreme did not disappear in the process of creation of the matter, it only hid itself. It hid itself so effectively that it seems as if it is dead. But it is not dead. It has the Supreme Consciousness in it, and that cannot be described as something dead. But it is something which is not visible. It is hidden. It is hidden very effectively. And it can also emerge, and that is what started happening with the creation of life. So living creatures started expressing a little more of that hidden consciousness, a little more of the consciousness of the Supreme. And these were living creatures, but in the most primitive creatures revealed only a little bit of it. Then came creatures which revealed a little more of it, and then came creatures which revealed still more, and these are the creatures we call had a mind. And the latest product of this process is the human being, who has the best developed mind by far. But if the trend in evolution is any indication, man is only the latest but not the final product of evolution, because we would all acknowledge that even as human beings, although we are all very proud of our achievements, we express only a very small fraction of the consciousness of the divine. Our capacity to know and do is extremely limited as compared to the capacity of the divine, and therefore there is scope for further expression, further revelation of that hidden consciousness. And just as the possibility of life was hidden in matter, the possibility for mind was hidden in creatures which had life but did not have a mind, the possibility of a creature far better than man, which will express much more of the divine consciousness, maybe all of the divine consciousness, or almost all of the divine consciousness, that possibility is hidden in human beings. And if the trend so far is an indication, that will happen in any case on its own as well. It can happen through the natural process of evolution, the way all previous evolution has taken place. But then here comes a difference between human beings and the creatures that came before us. And the difference is that human being is probably the first creature which not only has an urge to evolve, express more of his hidden divinity, but also has the capacity to do so. And therefore, human beings can now collaborate with nature in this process of evolution and carry this evolution further. And that, in a way, is the essence of the philosophy of Aurobindo and the Mother, the spiritual philosophy of Aurobindo and the Mother. And why they have talked about it at this stage of evolution on Earth is because they knew that the mental consciousness has more or less reached its peak, and now the process of evolution is poised for the next leap, which will bring about a distinct, perceptible, and very consequential shift in the level of consciousness. And the pinnacle of that would be the supramental consciousness. But between the present mental consciousness and the supramental consciousness, again there can be several stages, and there are, which Aurobindo has talked about in the Life Divine. But what it would effectively mean is that the present level of human consciousness, which is primarily ego-driven, will be replaced by a consciousness which will be primarily love-driven. And how that is consistent with the spiritual worldview will emerge as we talk today and in the next few sessions. But that is what will be the type of shift that will take place, and that is the basis, the foundation of Aurobindo and the Mother saying that the world will become a much better place to live in, because naturally a world which is based on love, which is founded on a very large number of people on earth who are driven by love rather than the ego, that naturally will make the world a much better place to live in. So that is their futuristic vision, and since we can accelerate the process of evolution, accelerating that type of a change in the world is in our own hands, in the hands of the human beings alive today. And that's why the Mother has said that those who are alive today are going through a very exciting phase in the exciting period in the history of the world. Now, the spiritual worldview that we have arrived at was through rational analysis. That is a philosophical method. There is a second method for arriving at these same truths, and that is the method of the mystic. The method of the mystic is that the person starts with that question, and instead of indulging in the type of reasoning that we indulged in, he concentrates on that question. And he's so absorbed in the getting an answer to that question that gradually everything else drops out from his life, becomes uninteresting, and he concentrates on just that single question. And that intense concentration, along with his life getting simplified because the rest of the things start dropping out, also leads to a great degree of purification of life. The purification of the type that was embodied in the yamas and the niyamas, for example, of Raja Yoga, which means that this person now becomes a much better person and also starts concentrating on this issue. And that's how probably all the meditative techniques evolved. And he also finds that since this is a long journey, he finds that I should take good care of my body, and partly through knowledge, partly through intuition, he gradually arrives at a particular way of living in terms of food, sleep, etc., which promise good health, and perhaps that is how the various yogic techniques evolved. And one day, this mystic finally has the answer in the form of an experience, the mystic experience. Now this person has answers, and these answers are similar to the answers which we arrived at by the rational analysis. And that is how the rishis and mystics across traditions have discovered these truths. Now, which of these two is better? The better is the method of the mystic. Why is that better? That's a better method because it leads to an experience. And an experience is far superior to any knowledge which is at the mental level. For example, there is a person who has never tasted anything sweet. If you tell this person, sweetness is a very present taste, it is perceived by the tongue. If you put this particular sweet in the mouth, it will taste sweet. If you add sugar to any food, it becomes sweet. You also give him a few recipes for making sweets. You give him the chemical formula of sugar. You do all that. And still you ask him what is sweetness, the person says, I still don't fully understand. But then you tell him, here is something, if you put it in your mouth, what you feel is sweetness. And in a moment, as soon as he has put it in his mouth, he knows what sweetness is. Because that's an experience. So if experience is far better than mental knowledge in a simple thing like sweetness, a sensory experience, you can understand how much better and how much more important it is to have a real experience instead of mental knowledge when it comes to these deeper truths which are in fact apparently beyond the intellect. The intellect can reach them through a rational process, but that is not the best method. And therefore, the philosophical method is an inferior method. And anything that we arrive at through the intellect can also be questioned. And therefore, if you ask me questions based on what we have talked about in the last half an hour or so, you start questioning those truths, you'll come up with some very good questions which not only I will not be able to answer, perhaps nobody can answer. Why? Because that is the business of the intellect, to question and doubt. And if you indulge in all those doubts and questions, you can always come up with questions which nobody can answer. On the other hand, one who had the experience, he has no questions, no doubts, because he has experienced it. And therefore, that is a much better method. He really knows. He knows it because he has experienced it. And that is why you find that Indian spiritual philosophy, like Vedanta, actually emerged from mystic experience. It was not purely a cerebral exercise that we indulged in today morning, and that's not what gave us Vedanta. Vedanta was based on mystic experience, and these experiences have been described most clearly in the Upanishads, and therefore Upanishads are the root of Vedanta. So the mystics had the experience, and then those experiences were fitted into a philosophy, and that philosophy is what we call Vedanta. And that is how that philosophy is helpful, and that philosophy is of the type that we were talking about today morning. That can be considered a Vedanta, a rationalistic way of presenting Vedanta. But then why did we indulge in that method if that is an inferior method and the mystic experience superior? Because that is all that can be done in a 1 hour talk. I can't give you mystic experience in a 1 hour talk. And since many of us will not have that experience in a whole lifetime, still knowing those truths is useful. And if we just accept them on trust and they stay with us as a belief, even that is good enough to guide us in life. And that is why we talk about it in that fashion. But that is certainly an inferior method. This also answers a few more questions, and that is, how do we know that the mystic's experience actually corresponds to a truth? The experience is there, but since the mystic can't share that experience with us, how do we know that what he is experiencing actually corresponds to a truth? To that one can give only an indirect answer, and the indirect answer is that people who have had this type of experience have been few and far between, but all the same there have been thousands of them in the thousands of years that the world has existed. And we call them by different names. In the Hindu tradition, we call them rishis. Re means to see. Rishi is one who has seen, which means he has experienced. So the Hindu tradition, we call them the rishis. In the Islamic tradition, they are called the Sufis. In the Christian and Judaic traditions, they are called the mystics. But all these mystics, Sufis and rishis have experienced similar things. Some of them have just experienced these truths and been satisfied with it. Some of them have tried to put out these experiences in words. Some of those words have survived, some have perished. But even what has survived of what they have expressed in words is enough to tell us that probably this corresponds to the truth, because thousands of people across traditions, across geographical barriers, across time barriers, have experienced truths which are very similar. That itself becomes an evidence of sorts. And some of such passages which are comparable, which are a part of this mystic experience, have been put together in a book called The Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley, where he has brought together the comparable experiences of the rishis, the Sufis and the mystics, and shown that how similar are the descriptions, in spite of the fact that the infinite may not reveal itself in exactly the same way to everybody. Aurobindo and the mother have talked about that too, that the infinite, which can express itself through such an astronomical variety in the universe, why do we expect that a mystic or a rishi will see that infinite in exactly the same way? Every rishi and mystic may not have exactly the same type of experience, but still there has been something fundamentally common to all these experiences, and that is why it has been possible for a person like Aldous Huxley to find out those comparable pieces and show that experience has probably been the same for each one of them. So that is still, people who are skeptical will raise more questions and will say that still it sounds very unscientific and so on and so forth. But then let me ask you a simple question. Suppose a scientist tells you that this leaf, which looks like a green sheet of paper, is actually not just a sheet, it is made up of thousands of cells. You would tell the scientist, I don't see the cells, so I don't believe you. What will the scientist tell you? The scientist will tell you, I saw those cells under the microscope. If you use a microscope, you will also see the cells. Which means that to get an experience, we have to use the same methods as the person who got that experience. Secondly, you have to have faith in the method. Suppose you say that I don't believe the microscope because I think the microscope does not just magnify what actually exists, the microscope creates images. It's a great creator. It creates new images, and therefore I don't believe the microscope. Then there's no answer. Which means that you have to have faith in the method and you have to use the same method. In the same way, if you tell a mystic that I don't believe your experience, what the mystic will say is, well, for that you have to use the same methods which I have used, and you have to have faith in the methods. And what are the methods that the mystics have used? Intense concentration and extreme degrees of self-purification. Basically these two things. intense concentration, and extreme degrees of self-purification. Looks very simple, just two things, but how many of us are willing to put in that type of effort? If we are not willing to put in that type of effort, we can't use the method which the mystic used. And if we don't use the method which the mystic used, how can we have the same experience? Just as we can't see the cells unless we use a microscope. And therefore, we may not have the same experience. We are also free not to believe the experience of the Rishi, but we can't question that the Rishi could not have had that type of an experience. That is something which we cannot do. That is something, if the Rishi says, I've experienced, we have to just accept, yes, he experienced it, even if we have not experienced it, even if we do not believe in that experience. But we cannot question that the Rishi could not have had that type of experience unless we use the same method. So the rational method or the philosophical method is inferior because, as the mother has said, one can prove the truth of anything by reasoning, but that does not make it true. So arriving at something by a rational analysis does not necessarily make something true. You can always question it. What you cannot question is an experience. Okay. Now we come to the philosophical system called Vedanta, the spiritual philosophy called Vedanta, which emerges from the experience of the rishis of the Hindu tradition. And we can sum it up like this, that the world is not an accident, it was created by the Creator. And the way the Creator created the creation was by itself becoming the creation. So the Creator became the creation. And thirdly, that the Creator has an all-pervasive presence in the creation. And fourthly, having created the universe, it has not abandoned it. It continues to be active in the creation, it continues to play a role in the creation, it is guiding the destiny of the creation. That is the fourth. So these are the four basic fundamentals of Vedanta, very clearly emerging from the Rishi's experience. But then, the intellect is very tricky. These simple truths which emerge from the Rishi's experience are the fundamentals of Vedanta, have been given different orientations. And one of the orientations is a life-negating tilt. That the world, therefore, is an illusion. Now, what is an illusion? Illusion is something which appears different from what it is. Yes, they are very true. What appears is a brick or a wall or a tree or a animal or a human being. But actually, that is only a surface appearance. What actually that entity is, all of them are basically the divine. And therefore, what is actually different from the way it looks. And therefore, it is an illusion. But then just one step beyond, the human being starts saying, since it is an illusion, it is a piece of falsehood. But that doesn't mean it is a falsehood. For example, a snake looking like a rope is an illusion. It is a snake but looks like a rope. But it may not be a rope, but it is a real snake. So it does not make it a piece of falsehood. But it's very easy for the human mind to take that one little step and say that since the world is an illusion, it is different from what it is a piece of falsehood. But then what is real? The real is the divine. Because that, all Vedanta would accept that yes, the real thing, the ultimate reality, the imperishable reality, the constant reality, and therefore the real reality is the divine. And however, we have to deal with the body and the mind, which do not let us see that reality. And therefore, the body and the mind are mere encumbrances. They are obstacles on the path of our realization of what is real. Because the real divine is beyond the body and the mind. But since we would not like to get satisfied with that illusion, therefore the purpose of life is to realize that reality, that ultimate reality. And the realization, the body and the mind are acting as obstacles. So let's try to get rid of them as soon as possible, and therefore possibly after death we'll get that merge with that reality, and that is the highest goal, to merge with that reality and escape the cycle of birth and death. Now what this forgets is, this type of way of looking at it is, that just by realizing that only the divine is real and my body and mind are not real, although they are real, but taking them as unreal because they are a part of an illusion, somehow I will die and merge with the divine is wishful thinking. Because the fact is that unless we use this body and mind which have been given us to us for realizing that reality, we will not get to that reality. But all the same, this type of a life negating tilt is very common, and this was, according to Aurobindo, one of the reasons for the decline of India over the last 1000 years. But this type of life negating tilt refuses to go away, and it has not totally disappeared even today. People can easily identify with some of the things that I was talking about, although I was trying to dismiss them also simultaneously, but many people can identify with those things, and the way we call them is sab aankhon ka dhokha hai. It's all a trick of our normal way of seeing things. It's an optical illusion. Aankhon ka dhokha hai, maya jal hai. It's a trap into which we have been trapped by the divine. All the this world and worldly life and all the temptations, obligations and complications of life are a type of a trap into which we have been trapped, and that is what is coming in our way of realizing the reality, not realizing that this trap itself is our vehicle for realizing that reality. But all these things people can easily identify with, because it's so easy to slip using that intellect, inventive intellect, from the basic facts of Vedanta, which we saw in the previous slide, to slip from these basic facts into a give them a life negating tilt. However, the same truths can be given also a life affirming tilt. That is a tilt which says yes to life. Yes, that's why this program is yes. Says yes to life. How is that? Yes, the world is a manifestation of the divine. That is, the world is the divine itself in another form. It has made itself visible in the form of the world. And if the divine is real, the world cannot be unreal. So, since the divine itself has become the world, it is another form of the divine. We can't accept one form of the divine, that is the one which is not visible, as real, and reject the other which is visible as unreal. And part of that visible reality are our body and the mind, and therefore they should also not be rejected. But in fact, they are our instruments. They have been given to us. Since that is the purpose of human life, the human beings have been given the urge and the capacity to realize that reality, to go deeper than what an animal can, deeper and higher than what an animal can. And the human being has been given this body and mind. These are our instruments. These are our instruments for realizing the reality. And what is the field of action for realizing the reality? The world and worldly life. So use that field, use these instruments to do what? Not just to realize the reality, but to transform life. Because life as it is imperfect. So, realizing the reality would be truly meaningful, worthwhile, if we are able to transform life in such a way that it actually becomes worthy of manifesting the divine. So, it should approach that perfection, and that is what yoga is about. That transformation, so that we live a life that is consistent with our being manifestations of the divine. And therefore, the highest goal of life is not to escape after death into some idyllic world where all this illusion will not be there, but the highest goal is to be always conscious of the divine and to organize our life around this awareness, so that our feelings, thoughts and actions, because these are the true instruments we have, our heart, head and hands. So our feelings, thoughts and actions should reflect the divine purity and perfection. Now, the last part is also something which is not easy even after the realization is there. Which means that a rishi might see the ultimate reality and yet may not be constantly aware of it. He is aware of it, he has got a glimpse of it, but he is not constantly aware of it. And unless he is constantly aware of it, he can't organize the entire life around this awareness. To illustrate this, I'll give you a story. In Indian mythology, there is a character called Ashtavakra. Ashta is 8, Vakra is curves. This person had 8 curves in his body, which means that he had a crooked body. Now this Ashtavakra one day entered the court of King Janak. Now this Raja Janak or King Janak was not only a king, he was also a great yogi. And this again shows that for being a yogi, it's not necessary to live in a forest. One can be a king and yet be a yogi, because the important thing is not to be attached to the opulence. So King Janak was the type who was not attached to his opulence, not attached to all the power and the glamour and the glory that he had. On the other hand, a hermit may be very attached to his begging bowl. And therefore, it's not poverty and denial which by itself leads to realization. This king was a yogi. And therefore, in his court, apart from ministers and all, there were many sages and saints. And one day, Ashtavakra arrived there in this court, and the sages and saints who were there, they started laughing the way an ordinary man would. They started laughing at him. Why? Because of his crooked appearance. So the first thing Ashtavakra told them was, because Ashtavakra himself was a rishi, the first thing he told them was that what type of rishis or saints or sages you are. You saw only my outer form, which is crooked. You failed to see the divine in me. Which means that even they were taken away by the appearance and could not see the divine in this, and they could not organize their life around this awareness of the divine. In spite of all the spiritual accomplishments, in spite of all the spiritual growth which these sages and saints had achieved. So being conscious of the divine or just being aware of this is one thing. Being aware of it all the time so that life can be organized around it is another. And this is one of the important things in Sri Aurobindo's and the Mother's yoga, and that is why their yoga goes beyond just personal realization of that ultimate reality. It goes even beyond that, because it should find an expression in our life. So that's why in short, Sri Aurobindo's yoga and the Mother's yoga is about an inner change which reflects itself in our outer life. Very simple but very difficult to achieve. So this is the life-affirming tilt Vedanta can be given. The same basic fundamental facts. None of these things in the life-affirming tilt are contradictory to what was said in those basic Vedantic truths, and yet you can give it a life-negating tilt and you can give it a life-affirming tilt. So Sri Aurobindo's philosophy is rooted in Vedanta, but it has been given a very strongly life-affirming tilt. And why that intensity was required for that life-affirming tilt? Why so much intensity? Because for the last 1000 years or so, India has been in the grip of a life-negating tilt. And it's not confined to India. In fact, a lot of people in the world feel that spirituality and worldly life are two different things. One can't be compatible with the other. And this type of dichotomy between worldly life and spiritual life is to some extent universal. And that is why Sri Aurobindo had to add a great deal of intensity and make a very powerful and rational case for life affirmation, which he has done in the Life Divine as well as in other works. But that is the basic book where he talks about his spiritual philosophy and has rationalized it. So in a way you can say that the Life Divine itself is a type of an Upanishad which has his personal experience. It is based on personal experience of him as a rishi, and for the sake of those who will not be convinced unless this knowledge is presented in rational terms, he has rationalized it in the Life Divine. And being a great thinker and an intellectual genius, the way he has rationalized it, few possibly can. Probably nobody has ever done it. So that is the type of incisive logic that he has used in rationalizing the basic truths of spiritual experience and given them a strongly life-affirming tilt. And in his philosophy, there's a great stress on evolution, natural evolution, the way it has been going on so far and will continue irrespective of our efforts, and conscious evolution, in which human beings can participate because they have this capacity and urge, and thereby accelerate further evolution, leading to a better future. So his vision is futuristic, that further evolution of consciousness, which means more expression of the divinity within us, will eventually lead to a world which will be much better than we've had. And basic change will be from the ego to love. Ego is a separative force. It is based primarily on a limited consciousness. I identify myself with the body and the mind and therefore think I am a distinct individual, others are different. It creates in me a mentality of me versus all the rest. And therefore my needs come first. my opinions are better than somebody else's opinions, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, love is a uniting force, and that is based on spiritual truths, because we may be different in appearance, we may have a clear-cut boundary defined by our skin, but there is something deeper that unites us. We are all manifestations of the same divine. That is what unites us. Or in simpler language, we are all children of the same God. And that is what unites us. And this similarity is more fundamental than the differences that divide us. And therefore, this sense of oneness, because of our being grossly similar at a fundamental level, gives rise to love. Because after all, whom are the people we love? Whom we feel are similar to us, are related to us, belonging to the same creation, being children of the same God, makes us all interrelated. So we are all interrelated and we are all one. We are all very similar. At the basic level, we are in fact identical. That is what generates love. And therefore, a world which will be based on love will think not so much in terms of whose need is what, whether it's my need or somebody else's need, but will just think in terms of which need is more important and address that need. And that will take away all the evils which characterize the world: inequality, injustice, misery and suffering. And when that goes, the world will become heaven. So that's how heaven and earth can become one. So that is the type of futuristic vision that Aurobindo and the mother have given to us. And the confidence is based on the fact that that evolution of consciousness is in any case inevitable. It has been going on for millennia and it will go on, but we have the privilege of contributing to its acceleration through our efforts. The more the number of people who get involved in this process, the faster it will go. So in short, there are two poles of consciousness. One is a purely mental consciousness. That is a consciousness which is restricted to what we can see and hear, what is compatible with our intellectual understanding, which is based primarily on sensory experience, to some extent on logic and our past experience and what we can visualize in the future in terms of our mind. So that is a type of mental consciousness, or a picture of reality which we construct based on our sensory experience and to some extent our logic and experience, which is not immediate but may belong to the past. So that is how we construct a picture of reality. That is what may be described as mental consciousness. The other pole is the mystic consciousness. This mystic consciousness includes everything that is there in the mental consciousness. But beyond it, higher than that, deeper than that, is another layer of consciousness which extends almost to infinity. And that's why all those dots around that sensory experience, around the mental consciousness, when it comes to mystic consciousness, at the center you still have the mental consciousness, but around that you have all those dots extending to infinity. So that is the mystic consciousness. Now these are the two poles of consciousness. Most of us are at neither of these poles. We are not even at the level of purely the mental consciousness, because we all have some sort of a dim awareness of something beyond the obvious, something beyond our ordinary sensory experience. That type of a dim awareness is there in most of us. And at the same time, we do not have the total consciousness of the mystic, so that we are constantly aware of it and can organize our life around it. That also we don't have, most of us don't have. Which means that most of us are somewhere on the spectrum, on the wide spectrum of consciousness between the mental consciousness and the mystic consciousness. But this fact that human beings can evolve during life, they have the urge and the capacity to manifest more of the divinity, means that no matter where on the spectrum we are, we always can take a few steps towards the mystic consciousness. And that is the purpose of life, the POL, to take a few steps. However, life can be misused and we can take a few steps backwards also, go more towards the mental consciousness from where we are. But the purpose of life is to move from that present level of consciousness, which means wherever we are on this spectrum between the mental and the mystic consciousness, to move from the point where we are towards the mystic consciousness, take a few steps. The more steps we take, the more the purpose would be fulfilled. See, it has been called the purpose of life, not the goal of life. Because the goal of life may be to reach the mystic consciousness. But for most of us, that is more than a lifetime's job. So we'll probably not get there in this life. But that doesn't matter. Any steps that we take in that direction will fulfill the purpose of life. So the purpose is different from the goal. The goal is a fixed destination, which may be a remote and theoretical point for most of us. But the purpose is within our reach. The purpose is direction oriented. That is within our reach, that we can all fulfill. And how we can fulfill it, we'll see in the next few sessions. So this just sort of is building that link between what we are talking today and what we'll talk in the 2 subsequent sessions on the purpose of life. So the purpose of life is to go beyond the ordinary consciousness in which we are, which is primarily mental but not restricted to the mental consciousness. From there towards the mystic consciousness, take as many steps as we can. That would be called conscious evolution or consciously doing our yoga. Because willy-nilly, even without being conscious of it, we may be taking a few steps, and that's how we have got where we are. That's how we got evolved into a human being. But then, having become human, consciously taking a few steps in the right direction is the purpose of life. Now here are a few questions. The spiritual worldview is the only worldview, an imaginary worldview, inconsistent with rationality based on experience. It is not the only worldview. There are other worldviews, including the scientific worldview, which says that somehow this happened and somehow that happened and somehow that happened. So those somehows are all ignored, which only conceal our ignorance, but still we can build up, starting with the Big Bang and formation of that primal soup, in which somehow there were a large number of chemicals which found the right conditions of temperature and pressure and so on, and somehow a cell was formed in which the process of life started ticking, and so on and so forth. So all those somehows we neglect, and we say, well, here is a scientific worldview. But all the same, that is a worldview, and therefore the spiritual worldview is not the only worldview. It's an imaginary worldview. No, it's not imaginary. It's based on experience, the experience of the rishis, and it is not inconsistent with rationality. We may not be able to prove it on rational grounds, but we can rationalize it. It is consistent with rationality, and that is what we have done today. And it is based on experience. Yes, it is based on the experience of a very large number of rishis and Sufis and mystics, and therefore it is based on experience. So that is the right answer. It is based on, the spiritual worldview is based on experience. Maybe of only a select few, but all the same, it is based on experience. The central feature of the spiritual worldview is the spirit of the divine is all pervasive. Yes, it is. That's a central feature. The name of the divine is Brahman. None, that is not, because you can give it any name. It has infinite number of names, and more can be given. The world was created accidentally. No, it was designed. It was not created accidentally. The world is unreal. No, the world being a manifestation of the divine cannot be unreal, because if the divine is real, the world is also real. So the correct answer is that the central feature of the spiritual worldview is that the spirit of the divine is all pervasive, and it is the word spirit from which has been derived the word spiritual. That is what gives us that derivation. All spiritual philosophies, means all spiritual philosophies, including Vedanta and other spiritual philosophies, irrespective of the spiritual philosophies underlying even religions other than Hinduism, all spiritual philosophies agree on all of the following except: the world is not an accident but was designed by a creator. That all spiritual philosophies believe in. The creator has an all-pervasive presence in its creation. That also all spiritual philosophies believe in. The creator continues to have a role in running the world. That also all spiritual philosophies agree on. The soul gets embodied again and again to return to the earth in a new body. That all spiritual philosophies do not agree on. But then Aurobindo has rationalized that also. Apart from being the rishis' experience that the souls get embodied again and again to return to the earth in a new body, that is rebirth, they are born again and again to continue the spiritual journey further, Aurobindo says that if reaching the true goal of life, human life, that is reaching the pole which was called the mystic consciousness, if that is the goal of life, and that is beyond most of us in a single lifetime, then being reborn becomes a rational necessity. That's how he's rationalized it. It becomes a rational necessity. So the point on which all spiritual philosophies do not agree is that they do not all believe in rebirth. For some of them, there is a soul, but then after death, the soul may rest in peace, or the soul may be disturbed because it did not use its life on earth well, that it did not use it for good actions, and therefore the soul will be disturbed, and therefore we pray for peace to the departed soul, that irrespective of how that person lived, may God give peace to the soul instead of leaving it in a disturbed state, deny it that peace. That across traditions we all do, because even in the Hindu tradition where we do believe in rebirth, we do want that the soul should rest in peace till it returns to the earth again and gets embodied again. Till then it should not remain disturbed, it should not stay in those realms of the other worlds where it will be tortured. So we do pray for peace to the departed soul, but not perpetual peace, peace till it returns to earth again in a new body. Now here are two of those fundamental spiritual truths in Aurobindo's words from Savitri. The world was not built with random bricks of chance. So the world is not an accident. In finite things, the conscious infinite dwells. So that is the universal presence of the divine in all finite things. Another question: spirituality is a fashionable substitute for religion. Sometimes that's how it is looked at. To be religious is to be old-fashioned. If you have to be in with the crowd, you should be spiritual but not religious. So spirituality is just a substitute, a fashionable, acceptable substitute in the modern world for religion. It's the foundation of all religions. In fact, that is true. All religions have an underlying spiritual philosophy. Spirituality is a camouflage for atheism. If you say that you don't believe in God, many people will not like you. So you might as well say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. That in a way it becomes a camouflage for atheism, for not believing in God. We forget that you cannot be spiritual without believing in a higher power, without believing in the supreme consciousness. You may not call it God, but you do believe in it, calling it by other names like the source of everything, the source with a capital S, or the divine with a capital D, or the absolute reality with the capital A and a capital R. So, you may give it any other name, but you are believing in that, then only you can be spiritual. So it's not a camouflage for not believing in that higher power. Spirituality is a tranquilizer without any harmful effects. This I got from an Indian intellectual who has said that while religion is the opium of the masses, spirituality is the tranquilizer of the rich. So religion is the opium of the masses, spirituality is the tranquilizer of the rich. So it's not that spirituality is only for the well-to-do, who may also be fashionable and therefore may like to have a substitute for religion, and then use spirituality as a tranquilizer, which also it can act, and the Lord doesn't mind it. As Sri Krishna says in the Gita, no matter how and for what reason you turn to me, you are acceptable. So even if you turn to him because you are mentally very disturbed and you want, instead of a tranquilizer, you feel spirituality will be better, it will not have the same type of side effects as a sleeping pill, that's also acceptable to the Lord. But then that is not all that spirituality is. It's not just a tranquilizer without harmful effects. Although it can be that, but it is not restricted to that. The best alternative is the foundation of all religions, because that is a fact. Spirituality is the foundation of all religions. Another question: Maya is a fraud played on man by God. Now what is Maya? Maya is usually translated as an illusion, but that is a mistranslation. Probably there is no word which is the exact equivalent of Maya in the English language. What Maya means, that God has put on an appearance, a visible form in the world. That is what Maya is about. But then that is not a fraud. The type of feeling that sometimes we have, that God has trapped us into a fraud, into a web of complications and obligations and temptations, that is not what Maya is about. Maya can be looked at another way. Just think of the one that was invisible becoming visible, a great miracle. Not only becoming visible, assuming a million forms, some which we call living and some which we call non-living, and which have an astronomical variety. So the same one entity assuming so many forms, capable of doing so many things, capable of playing so many roles in the world. It's like one actor having multiple roles. And sometimes actors do have multiple roles in movies. So if an actor has 3 or 4 roles in a movie, we say, what a great actor. See, he can play so many roles so effectively. The role that he's playing, he seems to be exactly that. We call him a great actor. Whereas here there is a super actor who is acting millions of roles so beautifully. How can we call that a fraud? It's a great capacity of the divine. It is not a fraud. It's a great capacity of the divine to be able to do that. So Maya is a capacity. It reflects the infinite capacity of the divine and not exhausting all the capacities of divine yet. It may have still other possibilities which are still not manifested or which we do not know about. So the one who has these infinite possibilities of manifestation cannot be called a fraud. That's a great capacity. So it's not true. And sometimes we justify it by saying that it's a fraud because it keeps the ignorant masses engaged in a meaningless life. Yes, ignorant we are. We don't have total knowledge. But life is not meaningless. Life is meant for moving from our present state of ignorance towards knowledge, or at least towards less ignorance. That is what the purpose of life is. That is what movement from one pole of consciousness to the mystic consciousness, from our present state of consciousness to the mystic consciousness. That is what one way of looking at is, that we are moving from partial knowledge to knowledge which is a little less partial, a little more complete. That is what. So it's not a meaningless life. Life does have a purpose. So we are ignorant, but life is not meaningless. And therefore, the reason is also a false statement. So both these statements are false. Assertion is false and reason is false. Maya is not a fraud and life is not meaningless. Again, this book, Understanding Spirituality, chapter 1 is titled Who Am I? But includes the spiritual worldview. And in fact, spiritual worldview occupies much more space in the chapter than Who Am I? And the ebook is available on Amazon. For a hard copy, you can drop an email to us on sa150yes@gmail.com. All this knowledge comes from the experience of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, and these are embodied in these books, The Life Divine and Savitri. Why I said the mother also is because Savitri has the spiritual experiences of Sri Aurobindo. It also has spiritual experiences of the mother. And it also has a lot of guidelines for the ordinary seeker to use life in a way that will fulfill the purpose of life. So it has also teachings for our own yoga. So Savitri in a way has 3 yogas: the yoga of Sri Aurobindo, yoga of the mother, and the yoga of the ordinary man. All 3 are there in Savitri. And this knowledge is concentrated. This knowledge which we have talked about in the last session and today's session is concentrated in Book 1, Canto 4, the secret knowledge. So the secret has been let out. And this book, Spiritual Wisdom in Small Doses, which is available to all of you for free download, all of you and anybody else, on yesspirituality.wordpress.com, has essays on just about everything that was touched upon today, things such as consciousness, Leela, Maya. Leela, is the game of the divine. For the Lord, it is like a game. We may take it very seriously, but to the Lord, it doesn't matter. We may be very worried what will happen as a result of global warming, the world will come to an end. But for the divine, it's nothing. It's like, a child has built up a big tower with the help of little blocks. And the child is very happy. See how nicely I have been able to balance all these blocks. Now it is so tall. And then, accidentally, if the child hits it, it falls and the child is sad. And if by chance the parent hits it and falls, the child is mad. But that tower falling, what does it mean to the parent? Oh, nothing. It's just a game that the child was playing. The child can play it again. So that's the way that for the divine, If the human beings become extinct or the world disappears, doesn't make much difference to the divine. For the divine, it's just a game. That's what Leela means. So you'll find essays on all these things: consciousness, Leela, Maya, spiritual philosophy, Vedanta, etc., etc. And the essays are very easy to locate because they're alphabetically arranged. For any comments or questions, please feel free to send us an email at essay150yes@gmail.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Aurobindo for making it all possible. And thanks to all of you for listening and joining in. Thank you. There is a question.
Good morning,
Good
Dr.
morning.
Ramesh. They used to always, there used to be a saying that the world is a stage and we are all actors. So you were saying it's the divine which does the act, which is the doing the action or acting in the creation. So does it mean that the divinity inside us, actually we ourselves as a man cannot do anything ourselves, but the divine in us is the which does everything?
To say that the divine in us does everything is true, and to say that man has a free will is also true. Because sometimes saying that the divine in us does everything can become an excuse for doing anything wrong and saying, well, the divine in me did it because I'm basically the divine. But then the fact is that the divine itself has also given us that free will to do what we feel like doing or to do what the divine is telling us to do. That capacity also the divine itself has given us. It's something like this. You see, the computers these days appear very intelligent. They seem to be capable of doing everything, knowing so much, and we feel that the computer is very intelligent. But it's not the computer which is intelligent, it's the programmer who built those programs which has built that possibility into the computer. So the divine is like that programmer who has built the possibility of free will in us, and we feel that, see, I can do it, I can do what I want. So in a way, that free will is also an expression of the divine, and therefore to use that free will is necessary. You actually started with another interesting statement that the world is a stage and we are all actors. That is also true, because the world is the field of action, and the life is the field that is given to us, all that we do and others do. And we are all actors in the sense that we are in a way being controlled by that ultimate programmer. Either sometimes we are using our free will which contradicts the divine will, sometimes we are using our free will to coincide with the divine will. But all the same, we are using our free will. Even when we decide to listen to the voice of the psychic being, that is also using the same free will. Now our free will is coinciding with the divine will. So in that sense, we are all actors. And that reminds me of an analogy which Gary Zukav has given to explain not only our existence in this world, but also in other worlds where we go after death. And those other worlds can be at different realms, heaven, hell, and everything in between heaven and hell. So several probably such other worlds. So the analogy that Gary Zukav has given is that we are all like part of a drama company, like a troupe. They are usually, at least they used to move from place to place. They'll perform a few plays at one place, and then they'll move like a circus from one place to another, and then go and put up the same type of plays at another place. So that we are like that drama company. So he says is that we have all belonged to a certain drama company in some other world. Why in some other world? Because in those other worlds, there is a sort of a segregation in terms of levels of consciousness, and the people with similar tendencies, similar habits, similar inclinations tend to stay together. Unlike Earth, where good and evil and everything in between is mixed up. So in those worlds, there is a relative segregation of good and evil. So we all belong to a certain drama company in some other world, and when we come to this world, we get scattered, and we get mixed with many people who belong to other drama companies. But then once in a while, we come across somebody with whom we strike an immediate relationship. We feel that this person, I have met this person for just half an hour, and this person, it seems as if I have known this person for ages, and we build up a lifelong relationship with that person. How does that happen? That happens because some sanskar, as we may call it in Hindi, some sort of an inbuilt intuition we have of the people who belong to the same drama company to which we belonged. So belonging to that drama company, we might have come and played many roles on this earth several times. Sometimes being the child of that person, and sometimes the grandparent of the same person, and sometimes being only a friend of that person. But in this life, once again, we end up meeting, and we feel that I've known this person for ages, and then we suddenly feel that how did it happen? We are surprised, but not such a big surprise. It is because we are part of the same drama company, and therefore, irrespective of the roles that we have been playing in different lives, we still recognize each other once again on this earth when we meet. And the primary thing is we belong to the same drama company, not the roles that we have played. The roles become secondary.
Thank you, sir. So you answered. My second question was about free will. You already answered that. But there is one more question. Why did the creation stop with the man?
It has not stopped. That's exactly the point of the talk, was that if the trend so far is in any indication, the evolution has not stopped. It will go on. Whether
So in terms of, we started with the single cell and we came up finally into a human being, right? That means there were millions and millions of creatures were there, and millions of even the animals and even the trees and everything. But after the man, where is it? What exactly has evolved?
Yes, after man, what it will be, that man cannot tell. But one thing which seems likely is that so far there has been evolution of form as well as consciousness. That is, say, roughly speaking, say from monkey to man, the form, not only the consciousness is different, the degree of expression of divinity is different, the form is also different. It is quite possible that there may be no further evolution of form because the structure has reached a certain level of perfection, the mental consciousness has reached a certain level of perfection, and therefore further evolution of consciousness may not necessarily involve a change of form. Probably that's what you meant, that man is final. Man is not final in terms of consciousness. Man may be final in terms of its form. So man is not final, man is not the latest product, but all the same, there may be not much change of form, because modern science, has found this much, that as people say change as a result of practice of yoga, there are certain structural changes in the brain, which means they are not visible outside, but there is a certain change in form taking place within. And those changes are maybe in terms of which parts of the cerebral cortex become thicker. That change may be in terms of which neurons get connected to which means that there may be greater richness of connections between certain sets of neurons. Those type of changes have been seen. But all the same, outside the human being still looks exactly the same, because those physicochemical changes going on in the brain, which are reflecting the change in consciousness, are not visible outside in the form that person is taking. And therefore, the form may not change, but the consciousness could change. So that is probably what you may consider as final. But certainly human being as he is only the latest product of evolution, not the final. But then that reminds me of another thing that we can discuss quickly now, and that is the difference between biological evolution. You seem to be a biologist, or at least know quite a bit of biology, between the biological view of evolution and the spiritual view of evolution. The two look superficially similar, but there's one fundamental difference. When it comes to biological evolution, we say somehow the universe was created, somehow the world was created, somehow that soup was created in which there was possibility of life, and somehow a cell emerged, and somehow from the cell other forms of life came. And then we talk about things like struggle for existence, and the useful mutations and useless mutations, the useful mutations getting preserved, and that's how different forms of life evolved. But in spiritual evolution, there's one fundamental difference. We do not start with something which was extremely simple and then somehow the complexity came as a new feature. In biological evolution, all these are new features which keep appearing, which keep making the form of life more and more complex and capable of doing more. So that appears to be a process which is somehow happening, facilitated by things like a large number of random changes taking place, the useful ones, those which are useful for survival getting preserved and the rest getting rejected, and that's how the changes are taking place. But all these new characteristics are appearing de novo as if from somewhere, which we don't understand. But in spiritual evolution, we do not have that mystery. We start with dead matter, which itself has all the possibilities in it, because the total consciousness of the Supreme is hidden even in dead matter. So there's nothing new appearing, it's just greater expression, greater revelation, a bit of unfolding, but it is nothing is de novo. Nothing new is being created. It's only greater expression of that consciousness. So that is one fundamental difference between biological evolution and spiritual evolution. Okay.
Thank you, sir. But it's all beyond my limited this one capacity to understand. But I think we should read a lot of these books which you have suggested.
It doesn't matter. The mind has its. That is one of the features. Your questions will never be fully solved. Your doubts will not completely go, and it's good that you raised all those questions, which brought out a little more discussion. So that is an endless process. So long as we have a mental consciousness, the mind will work, and the business of the mind is to question. And so we'll keep having those questions. And it is through questions that we learn in science, and it is through questions that we have also learnt in spirituality.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With this, we come to the end of today's session. Tomorrow, we will have another practical session by Miss Malika. And today, we end with the meditation music. Thank you, everyone, for joining.